policy, as we're in a critical period of change and opportunity. We are currently consulting on the potential policy changes through the local plan, and the consultation runs until the 18th of February. It is important to the council that we give people an opportunity to have a bigger say in helping to shape our future planning policy direction. The first webinar was held on the 21st of December, and it was to discuss how individuals and communities can get involved in the plan making process and how to respond to the current consultation. It was recorded and you can access that through the council's website. Today is the second webinar, and we are focusing on the policies to manage houses in multiple occupation, also known as HMOs. HMOs form an important part of housing stock, both for young professionals and for students. However, there can be negative issues arising in areas where HMOs are highly concentrated. The council is reviewing and updating its planning policy framework to help address and manage these issues. So I'd now like to introduce my panel today. So starting with myself, my name is Dina Romero and I'm the leader of Bath and North Somerset Council. I'd now also like to introduce Richard Deone, who is the Deputy Head of Planning Policy, Carew Jakes, who is the Principal Planning Officer, and Alice Nunn, who is a Planning Officer, also focusing on policy, and Chris Mordaunt, who is our Housing Standards and Improvement Manager. And finally, I'd also like to present our Cabinet Member for Housing and for Planning and Economic Development, Councillor Tim Ball. And I'm going to first ask Tim to explain how the council is seeking to update their policies and guidance in relation to HMOs and how the public can be involved in this process.
Thank you, Dina, and good afternoon, everybody. Current local plan policy and guidance aims to encourage a sustainable community in Bath by encouraging an appropriately balanced housing mix across the city, supporting a wide variety of households in all areas. It includes seeking to ensure that houses of occupation are located in appropriate and sustainable locations. There's also a need to seek to control and manage issues commonly associated with higher concentrations of HMOs in the local area. The planning system has an important role to play, and we're updating policies in the local plan and supplementary planning guidance.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I'd like to pass over to Carew and to Alice, who will be giving us a presentation.
Thank you very much. Michaela, can you put the presentation on? Yeah, thank you very much. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Carew Jakes from Planning Policy, and I am presenting this short presentation. We have about 11 slides. Then I will set the sort of basic information, and my colleagues Alice will go through the planning policy approach and also the changes we are proposing. Can I have a next slide, please? Right. Okay, thank you. And yeah, thank you very much. Okay, to start with, what is HMO? Houses in multiple occupation. So this is a house or flats that is occupied by 3 or more people from 2 or more households who shares basic facilities such as bathroom, toilets, and kitchen. There is some exemptions, or I say some, but it's quite a few exemptions. One of them would be if you are home occupier, home owner, so that you can have up to 2 lodgers. So even though you are more than 3, it's not counted as HMO. And also some facilities run by established education sector, so that's not counted as HMO. And so what is the difference between a small and large HMOs? So we have, in planning terms, we have 2 different use class. So the planning use class C4 is accommodation having 3 to 6 occupiers. Then sui generis is the, we describe it as accommodation, accommodating more than 6 occupiers, residents. So it's a 2-type different use class for HMOs. So then quite often we are asked, what is the difference between planning permission and HMO license? So then this 2 area, it's quite different. So we have to meet the different legal requirements. So it's operating in different legal system, and also it's the issues we try to address are different. So it's the permissions, planning permissions, we can manage the land use, and the HMO licensing, this is mainly focusing on quality of properties and also the safety for the occupiers. So next question, please, Michaela. Yeah, so the role of HMOs, as Dina mentioned, HMOs are very important part of our housing stock. It's providing homes for a wide range of people, could be students or graduates or young professionals or contract workers. In Bath, we have lots of tourism related businesses. So they're quite often the people working in the service industry find that it's easier to live in this HMO properties. And so it provides a more affordable form of accommodation. And of course, it's high concentration or large number of HMO in a small concentrated area has some issues. So it's not all HMO occupiers or landlords are not managing well, but it just some concentrated area has some issues. Commonly associated issue could be like a noise disturbance and unmanaged, unkept gardens or waste management and car parking, and also the change of use. The HMOs often change of use from C3, which is the dwellings, the family home, into multiple occupation. So it could be losing affordable family housing, and also have some impact on the local communities. Next slide, please, Michaela. Right, so it's understanding these issues, we set out the planning policy and our framework. So I would like to introduce Alice Nunn to go through our current policies and also the approach we are looking.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. So I thought it'd be useful to start off by running through the main legislation and policy and guidance which shapes the way that the council assesses planning applications for new HMOs. So the council adopted an Article 4 direction in 2013, and that's within the Bath city boundary, and that relates to HMOs. So prior to that, the change of use of a residential dwelling in C3 use class to a small HMO was permitted development, and that didn't require the submission of a planning application. And the effect that the adoption of the Article 4 direction had was to remove that permitted development right. So now within the city, the Bath city boundary, planning permission is required for the change of use of a residential dwelling to any size HMO, so whether that is small or large. And the Article 4 direction doesn't stretch further than the City of Bath boundary, which means that in the wider district, planning permission is only required to change the use of a dwelling to a larger HMO. With regard to local planning policy, the main relevant policy to relating to HMOs is policy H2, and that's in the placemaking plan. It sets out the various criteria that are assessed when determining a planning application for the change of use of a residential dwelling to an HMO. So that includes, amongst other criteria, seeking to restrict HMOs in areas where a high concentration already exists. And then to support the policy H2 in the placemaking plan, the council also has an HMO supplementary planning document, and that provides further detail and guidance on the topic of HMOs. Its main focus is around the tests that were to determine whether an application might lead to an unbalanced mix of housing in an area, and I'll come on to that a little bit later in more detail. If we have the next slide there, please. Thank you. So the council are currently carrying out a consultation on the options document as part of a proposed partial update to their local plan, and this update covers a range of issues, and it also seeks to update policy H2 relating to HMOs. Policy H2 currently only relates to a change of use from C3 to HMO, and the current wording doesn't provide policy on assessing a number of different types of application, including new build HMOs or the change of use of another use to an HMO. So that might be a shop or a pub changing to an HMO. And it doesn't include guidance on how to assess intensification of an existing HMO. So that's the change of use from a small HMO to a large HMO. So the draft policy wording set out in the consultation document looks to increase the scope of the existing policy to refer to both new build HMOs and change of use from other uses to HMOs. And it also looks to introduce a new policy that relates to the intensification of HMOs, which sets out relevant assessment criteria by which applications need to be assessed. Now, one of the criteria also being consulted on is a requirement that all new HMOs achieve an energy performance certificate rating of C or better. National legislation already requires private rented accommodation to achieve an E rating, and the government held a consultation recently which set out aims to upgrade as many private rented homes as possible to a C rating by 2030. So this policy that we're looking into would be in line with this consultation and the general aims of the government. Nationally, council's aims to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we're currently working closely with the housing team at B&NES to understand whether we have the evidence to require this and whether it can be taken forward to draft plan stage. And Chris, who's a member of the panel today, may be able to answer some questions on that if they come up. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide just shows the key dates relating to the local plan partial update and shows the stages at which stakeholders and members of the public can comment on the proposed consultation on the options document is currently live, and that's running till the 18th of February. So this consultation gives you the chance to express any preferences to the options set out in the document before the council starts preparing draft policies. Following on from the options consultation, the next stage is for the council to publish a draft plan, which will be consulted on formally in May and June this year. And any comments submitted at this stage will be sent to the independent inspector whose job it is to determine whether the plan is sound. We're aiming to submit the draft plan for examination in August, with hearings due to take place in winter this year, so 2021. And it's just worth noting here that anyone who's objected at draft plan stage has the right to be heard at the hearings. And then, yeah, just at the end, they're hoping to adopt the local plan partial update by spring 2022. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. So alongside the local plan partial update, the council is also reviewing its HMO supplementary planning document, or SPD. So as I touched on before, the guidance document sets out the tests undertaken to determine whether a planning application might lead to an unbalanced mix of housing in a certain area. So I thought it would be useful to briefly run through the current assessment criteria set out in the SPD, which is used to assess applications for new HMOs. So there are 3 stages to the assessment. The first is a sandwich test, which checks whether the proposal results in any residential property being sandwiched between 2 HMOs. And if it does, then that application is likely to be refused. The second is a test to assess whether the proposal is located in a census output area with over 10% concentrations of HMOs. And the third is a test to assess whether there is a 10% concentration of HMOs within the immediate 100 metres that surround the application property. Now the 10% concentration level is the level at which the council considers to be a balanced concentration of HMOs in a given area. So anything above the 10% concentration is considered to create an unbalanced mix in the area. So the second and third tests there set out in the SPD seek to restrict any further HMOs in the areas where that 10% concentration threshold has already been reached. Can you have the next slide there, please? Thank you. So the review of the HMO SPD that's currently taking place is at evidence gathering stage at the moment. We're due to be carrying out stakeholder engagement throughout February. The review is looking at a number of issues that have been raised during previous engagement sessions. The first is looking at whether the 10% concentration threshold that I just touched on there is at the right level, or whether that needs changing. We'll also be reviewing whether the 100-metre measurement test could perhaps be more localised, so that could potentially be at street level. So we'll look at the pros and cons of a different type of test there. We're reviewing the sandwich test in relation to how it applies to flatted developments, because the current guidance doesn't provide assessment information on that. And then we're also looking at whether there could potentially be a mechanism to safeguard affordable family homes from conversion, and whether or not we have any evidence to show that we could potentially look at that. And these issues are all at quite an early stage of review. And as I mentioned, we'll be working with key stakeholders throughout February with progressing the review. Our aim is to publish the draft SPD for consultation in May, and that'll be alongside the local plan partial update draft consultation. Have the next slide there, please. Thank you. And yeah, finally, we've just popped up on your screens there some useful information. At the top's the email address to the planning policy team for if you have any questions following this session. And the other one to point out there is the second one down, which is the link to the planning policy website, which will take you to the link to the local plan partial update consultation, so you can submit comments on there. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you very much, Karu. So I'm now going to start asking some of those frequently asked questions. But before I do, I'm going to pick up on a point that was raised during the presentation, which was around the energy performance certification. And I'm going to ask Chris if he could perhaps explain in a bit more detail about why the council is seeking to increase the EPC requirement for HMOs to C when other rental properties only need to be at an E rating.
Thank you, Dina. Yeah, sure. The current minimum legal standard is an E, which is quite low and is relatively poor energy efficiency. A lot of the B&NES HMO stock is either E or D. In fact, 75% of the HMOs in B&NES in Wirral in Bath are D, E or worse, and therefore that's got its own consequences in terms of heating costs, and the ability of to keep those properties warm. Additionally, the council priority for carbon zero will require, significant improvements in all energy efficiency of all residential stock, and so and this improvement will just help send the right message and just be moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Chris. And I know lots of people will be wanting to know what they can do when they're living in a rented accommodation and therefore might not be able to make structural changes. Some of these questions I know have been answered in our previous webinar on green homes. I wondered if you had anything that you wanted to say at this moment on this issue.
So, yes, I mean, I think the most important thing is to actually talk to your landlord about or agent about the improvements. Ask to see the EPC. Every tenant is entitled to see their EPC and have a copy of it, and ask for improvements if they don't reach the minimum standard. And be aware of there's some schemes available at the moment which help fund the landlord to make improvements. There's a government green home scheme and there's a local scheme in B&NES. And then on top of that, there's a few things you can do, not a lot you can do, things like, making sure your heating controls are set correctly. You're sure you find out how your heating system works, the main thermostatic control, to make sure it's set at the right level for you and not overheating the house as far as you're concerned. Check your radiators. There are quite often radiators in each room. If you've got a central heating system, have got thermostatic radiator valves that you can also control to get the right level that's comfortable for you. And also potentially, just look at simple things like, window coverings, like curtains, and use that to the best of your ability. That's the main thing.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Chris. So another question that comes up quite a lot, and I think is confusing. I know that you did cover this in the presentation, but is there a little bit more information you can give that explains the difference between planning and licensing? And that's a question I think perhaps Caro and Alice would like to pick up.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yes, that's it's really it's the key point is the issues we try to address are different, and so the planning wise, yes, we have been monitoring the new HMOs. I mean, it started from 2014. So 2014, the change of use from C3 dwelling house to HMO were permitted development. So it's so there's no mechanism to monitor. So they could change family home to HMO, HM to family home without any planning. So that's why it's the certain area in Bath. It's the HMO number increased so significantly. So the council monitored, gathered information as much as we could, and so we introduced Article 4 direction, which is to remove the permitted development. So it's so introduce Article 4 so that anybody applying C3 dwelling to HMO had to apply for planning permissions. So at the same time, we introduced planning policy and also the HMO SPD, supplementary planning guidance document. So that sets out, as Alice mentioned, all these 3-step stages. So we can apply that to assess. So we can see the amenity issues, the impacts on the local community. So we can apply these steps to assess HMOs. And of course, it's when we introduced, it started with a 25%, but monitoring shows 25%. It's already tipping the point, or tipped the point. So we lowered down to 10%. So then, that's that sort of planning application we determine in accordance with our policy and SPD. So that's trying to issue the local amenity issues on the neighbours and the issues in the impacts on the community. So that's sort of what planning trying to do. Then, but licensing is different, and they deal with the property and the safety of occupiers, and so different regulation. So I sometimes hear why people have to apply both of them, or why people licensing can be still issued while planning permissions are not determined. Then, but because we have to work in a different legal framework, it is quite difficult to address this. But so we and the Chris housing team work together. Then so when people apply licensing, it's on their website. They say check planning, so to make sure we cross-reference. So we try our best to make sure applicants and also this so everybody understand where we are. But I just wondered whether Chris want to add anything else.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it really, Karu. It's HMO licensing is about the safety and management of individual HMOs, mainly for the benefit of the occupants. We do, the management side does bring in some extra issues like waste management and gardens. But yeah, it's mainly safety and management for the purposes of the occupants. Yeah, thank you.
And it should be clear that you need both pieces of, we need both regulations to be addressed when you are considering whether or not to turn a property you own into an HMO. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Now, I've got a question that's come in, and it's about, do these same regulations apply outside of Bath? Obviously, I'm trying to find the question, which is, I live outside of Bath. Do I need a planning permission to use my property as a small HMO? Tim, perhaps this is a question for you.
Yes, well, where this can cause confusion. No, you don't. A change of use from C3 dwelling to C4, a small HMO occupied by 3 to 6 people is normally permitted development. A change of use of dwelling from C3 to C4, a large HMO occupied 7 or more people, will require planning permission. However, the Article 4 directive to remove permitted development right was introduced in Bath in 2013, and we always planned to update this as we needed to.
Thank you. And actually, you've led quite neatly into the next question I wanted to ask, which was about Article 4 directives and how the SPD has been applied across the whole of Bath. And I think I'm going to ask Richard if perhaps he can explain that perhaps in a bit more detail.
Yes, thank you, Dina. Yeah, the Article 4 direction, as we've already outlined, and as Tim has outlined there, removes that permitted development right, so that you have to put a planning application in if you want to convert your family home to an HMO. Now, the reason that applies across the whole city is so that the council has the opportunity to assess the impact caused by creating a new HMO and the level of harm that would cause. And in effect, that helps us to manage those areas of high concentration, because I do think we have to accept that HMOs are an important part of the housing stock across the city, not just for students, but they provide a more affordable means of accommodation for non-students, for young professionals, for example. So I think the council does accept, HMOs do play a role across the city, but it really is those areas of high concentration where it leads to an imbalance in the community and other issues, that's where it can cause a problem. So really the Article 4 direction and the associated local planning policies and the supplementary planning document are all around trying to manage as best we can those areas of high concentration. And just to follow on from what Tim said really about areas outside the city, we haven't introduced an Article 4 direction for areas outside of Bath at this point in time, and that is because in order to introduce an Article 4 direction, it's quite a it's a high bar that you have to test, that you have to pass, nationally. So we would have to be able to demonstrate that there was significant harm arising from HMOs, and particularly concentrations of HMOs in other parts of the district. And to this point in time, we haven't been able to, if you like, collect that evidence and demonstrate that level of harm. But that again is something we can keep under review into the future.
Thank you, Richard. So you sort of touched on a question that has come up several times, both in the pre-submitted questions and also in the question and answer function on this webinar. And I'll sort of paraphrase what many are saying, which is some areas are saturated with HMOs, and what can the council do to reverse this? And then I'll just pick up on a point that was made by one of the as it submitted a question, which is there any way policy can be updated to place stronger limits on the number of HMOs in certain areas of the city? I mean, obviously, it may be considered a plus or possibly a negative that might encourage landlords to focus on other areas of Bath as well. I'm not sure who would like to answer that first. Perhaps Richard?
Yeah, I can make a start on that one. I suppose it's important to just note that the planning system can only address applications to create a new HMO. So we can't apply, if you like, the planning restrictions retrospectively. And as Karu's already outlined, the Article 4 direction wasn't introduced until sort of 2013. So, some areas of high concentration of HMOs has in effect already arisen in the city. So we're unable to retrospectively sort of reverse that trend. What I would say is, I suppose that through the local plan partial update, we are looking to, in connection with the universities, to encourage further purpose-built student accommodation to be provided primarily on campus. Now, if that does happen, there is the potential that some of the HMOs that have been created and accommodate students, some of those could revert back to family housing, although clearly, again, there's no guarantee of that. I don't know, Tara, whether you wanted to add to that at all with any more detail.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this, as Richard mentioned, it's once planning permission are granted, it stays with the property, so the council can't really take that the rights away. So then, but we are monitoring the this new HMOs. Yeah, we can only deal with the new HMOs. That's the quite difficult thing, sister. So then, but as I mentioned earlier, we started with 25% concentration, but we reduced to 10%. Then now we are reviewing the approach. It's good, but it is quite difficult issue because it's as I mentioned, HMOs provide quite important homes for wider range of people, not just the students. So then going lower than 10% is quite difficult, and nationally 10% is the lowest we see, and no local authority gone beyond that. And but we are considering a different approach, whether we look at the specific area with a lower percentage, but it's yes, again, that's, we have to gather more evidence, and you have to be robust to justify. So this consultation is really useful. So we're revising a local plan main policy, as well as we are already working on the SPD revision. So it's all the comments we receive, it will be really important, and we will respond, we will look at it, and then we review our approach.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. Tim, I know you wanted to add something here.
Yes, I did. In 2011, when I took over the portfolio last time, we found we had a spiralling market out of control, with HMOs virtually appearing in every street. Certain streets of Westmoreland, I think, are 90% HMOs at the moment. And we looked at that situation and found that couldn't continue. So we looked at the situation, and in 2013 we brought in the Article 4 directive to actually limit permitted development on HMOs. At the same time, we also brought in HMO licensing, which people turned around and said there was no need for at the time, but we produced the evidence and introduced that licensing scheme to ensure that people living in HMOs had a decent quality of accommodation to actually live in. So it was putting restrictions on the market to ensure that we have balanced communities from that point forward. And we 25% was originally introduced, then 10%, and we always said we review it. Now we're reviewing it again now because the balance isn't right. We must get the balance correct this time. That's what a consultation is now taking place on revisions of supplementary planning document and planning guidance.
Thank you, Tim. And I guess it'd be useful to know, just to, approximately how much of our HMO, those that are used as HMOs, are actually being used for professionals or by professionals as opposed to by students. Carrie?
Yeah, this is good. We think is about a third of the HMOs are occupied by non-students, and 2/3 are occupied by students. But yes, we looking at census data, for example, 2011 census, it shows about 50-50. So then, but since then, universities have grown and the student number increased. And so now it's looking at the council tax exemption data and HMO data. We think it's about a third are non-students.
Thank you, Carrie, and that's led very neatly to my next question, which is, why does the council not require HMO residents to pay council tax?
Shall I take that again?
Yes, of course, Carrie.
Okay, so that's just to leave HMO aside, but it's actually the council tax regulation is set nationally. So it's nationally, it's full-time students are exempt from paying council tax. When this was introduced, local government were receiving some grants instead, but this grant's gone. So that's it is quite difficult for the council. It's this grant's gone, but the regulations to exempt students are still there. So we are not allowed to charge council tax to full-time students. So nothing we can really do at the moment, but we are lobbying to the central government to bring some form of grants or change the council tax the regulation. So it's so it doesn't matter HMO or not HMO, but full-time students are exempt.
Thank you. I think that's very, very clear. So if a house is occupied by professionals, then they would be expected to pay council tax. Tim?
Yes, the very point you just picked up, Dina. Non-students pay council tax. If you have one non-student in a property and the rest are students, council tax is applicable to that property. I'm correct. Carol was telling me if I'm wrong.
Thank you. And there's no, councils don't have any special powers to override this exemption.
No, we don't have. So yeah.
Thank you. I know as a councillor, that's one of the questions I get an awful lot in the days when you could go and have those conversations on the doorstep. So another question that comes up a lot is around parking. And so we were talking earlier about the impact of having, large numbers of people living in one property. And one of the impacts is on parking. Lots of our streets, particularly in Bath, are narrow, were never built for the large numbers of cars that are now quite often parked along them. Do we have anyone who'd like to perhaps make a comment on that? Alice?
I can pick that one up if that's okay. So the council are we're updating our parking supplementary planning document at the moment. And that will include parking standards for HMOs, which the standards don't at the moment.
Okay.
So work's currently being carried out to determine what the standards are going to be. And we did a study last year, which is being used to evidence this that we're looking at the moment. And it shows that in general, the car ownership numbers for HMOs is very similar to C3 residential dwellings. So we do need to look into that further, but that's the information we're using to create these car parking standards. The aim is that the draft parking SPD will be out for consultation in May this year at the same time as the local plan partial update, so that people can comment on it at that point.
Thank you. Yes, and so there is quite a number of consultations that are happening at this moment. So please, check out what consultations are happening on our website and make sure that you put your views in, because we will consider all of the views and take them into account when we come to the conclusions that we will need to. So I've got to know some sort of questions about enforcement. What happens if you suspect somebody what happens if you suspect that there is an unlawful HMO in your neighbourhood? Who should you contact?
Maybe I take that. It's so the planning department, we have enforcement team. So if you suspect HMO without planning permission, so you can go to our planning website, then you can submit the form. So then it's all the process is set out on the website. And so the enforcement team will do the site visit and collect information, look at the council tax information or something like that. So they will investigate. But so when they have a robust evidence, they can proceed this enforcement process. So then, but that is for the planning. And also probably Chris can add a bit more about enforcement side in the licensing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's similar for HMO licensing. So if we've got a public register of all licensed HMOs, and so if you believe a property is being used by 3 or more people sharing from different families, then you can check to see if it's licensed, and if it's not, please contact us at Housing Services. The contact information is all on our website, and we'll follow up and investigate, and where necessary, take enforcement action. There's financial penalties that we generally use as a sanction for that.
And I guess there's always going to be some household setups that won't be HMOs. I know you did cover this in the presentation, Karen and Alice. So could you just remind me of the point you were making about lodgers and whether or not they should be considered as forming an HMO and subletting? And what about cohabiting couples as well? Alice?
Yes, so the properties that contain and sort of an owner-occupier with his or her family, and that does include unmarried couples, can have up to 2 lodgers without it being considered to be an HMO. But if there's an owner-occupier with their family with 3 or more lodgers, that's when it becomes an HMO. If you're subletting rooms in a rented house, that will count as an HMO.
Thank you, Karen.
So I think you just you blipped a little bit. So I just mentioned what she said. It's So it's if you are in a rented property, if you have 2 lodgers, then that become HMOs. So it's so I think that's if you are a homeowner, you can have up to 2. But if you are renting the property, you can't have additional occupiers.
Thank you. Okay, so I think now I want to move on to whether there's a demand and how this demand will there still be a demand in the future? So we already know that many people are working from home, and as you said before, so 2/3 of our HMOs are probably occupied with students, or would in normal times. But if they're mostly working from their homes, is there going to be such a demand in the future for HMOs, or would an alternative form of accommodation be more appropriate, such as a purpose-built student accommodation block? And what can the council do if to sort of judge that demand?
If I can start off, and then perhaps Kerry can add something after. So I suppose we're unlikely to know the full impact that COVID and working from home is going to have on demand for HMOs until universities have had a chance to sort of collect and share data around student numbers and people working from home. But what we did do was circulate a demand survey relating to demand for HMOs to letting agents across the district. That was in December. And that was just to try to gauge whether there was still a demand at the moment for HMOs. And the responses from the survey sort of indicate that overall there is currently a medium to high demand for HMOs, and that's particularly in Bath City. But it is, yeah, as Dina said, it's worth noting that even if student demand did go down, there would likely still be a demand from the non-student occupiers living in the city. But Kerry may have something to add to that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. So because we are also consulting on a different approach to manage student accommodations in this local plan partial update consultation. So we are considering, council's preferred approach is new purpose-built student accommodation on campuses. So then, but as you can see, there's a many built or permitted in a city centre. But so we are just like strengthening that approach more on campus, or actually allocate some student accommodation somewhere, or so we are sort of considering options. So then if you can look at our option document, so we kind of suggest a number of different approach to manage purpose-built student accommodation. So we're working with universities to understand the numbers, and also the how we manage, and so that's and also there's not just I mean, currently we've seen lots of studio type of purpose-built accommodations, so that's too expensive for particularly for our domestic local students. International students might have a different budget, and they might prefer the studio type, but we want to have a purpose-built student accommodation equivalent to HMO kind of properties. Still, purpose-built accommodation could be more expensive, but that is something we are working with the university. So it's we feel cluster flats, more reasonable price, cheaper range of accommodation could probably be more equivalent to HMO kind of accommodation. So it's this consultation document. So we are discussing the approach to purpose-built student accommodation as well. So it'd be helpful if you can have a look at that too.
Thank you, and we'll make sure all the links to all these different consultations accompany this webinar when it's put up onto YouTube as well. So thank you, Karu. Tim.
Yes, the need issue is something we probably can't answer properly at the moment. We're in a pandemic at the moment. It's not going away very quickly. We will have to see what need actually comes through in the next few months and few years to actually make a proper judgment on the issue. PBSA's, purpose-built student accommodation, is probably best on campus. You only have to look at the amount of travelling taking place throughout the city as well, and we are a very small city, congested roads, and PBSA is probably better on student campus where universities actually are. There's always going to be a need for HMOs for key workers, etc., who cannot afford to pay rent elsewhere. So that has to be balanced, though, with communities of where those actually are actually in itself, to ensure we have a proper balance across the city itself.
Yes, it's all that question of balance, isn't it? And making sure that we've got the right sorts of accommodation for a variety of people that need different types of accommodation. Okay. So I was just having a quick look through the chat and seeing, sorry, not the chat, the question and answer section, to see if we have broadly answered most of the questions. I think we have by and large. You know, there's a few that, and also this refers to some of those that were sent in prior to the webinar as well, where people sent in quite long, complex and quite site-specific questions, and so those questions will be answered probably separate to this webinar, as I see we're coming towards the sort of end 10 minutes of it. I guess maybe this is a question, so it's quite a basic question. Can the council just, you know, just make a blanket decision and stop any more HMOs actually getting permission?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
waiting for somebody to jump in here. Caru.
Yeah. We do understand the issues, and but it's as we mentioned earlier, this HMO provide quite important home for wider range of people. So blanket policy doesn't work. Then you have to address the specific issues. So we, as earlier, I mean, we talked about some issues relating to noise and waste or garden or local communities. So then we introduced policy to address this, but the blanket policy doesn't do that. And the blanket policy, it has a danger of depriving HMOs. For example, it's if we don't allow any more HMOs, for example, near RUH hospitals. So maybe we are depriving the chance for medical sector, young professional nurses to live close to the hospital where they work. So it's we can't really, we have to make sure we have a good balanced supply of housing types to the community.
And part of the way that we will make sure that we have the right amounts of the right types of housing stock is those conversations that we're having, you know, with the universities and also with the RUH as well.
Yes.
Thank you. So as we come into sort of the last 6 or 7 minutes of this webinar, I'd like now to just ask each of our panelists if they've got anything else they want to add, anything that you know, perhaps they might have been expecting a question on that hasn't been asked. So if I start with Richard, and I'll sort of work around my screen that way. Richard first.
Thanks, Dina. Yeah, I think I did notice in the Q&A function there were a couple of questions particularly around purpose-built student accommodation, and I think the concern that, you know, sometimes a concentration, not necessarily just of HMOs, but a concentration of students more generally can give rise to concerns. And I think, as you know, Tim has already said, the council is aware that there has been, you know, student accommodation schemes coming forward within the city. We are looking at options as to how we restrict that and consulting on those options through the partial update. Our main approaches. The first one is to try and direct the student accommodation schemes to on campus by really saying that if someone wants to put an application in for that sort of accommodation off campus and elsewhere within the city, they need to clearly demonstrate there is a need through some form of formal agreement with the university, so that it's not just a speculative student accommodation scheme. The other option is to maybe include purpose-built student accommodation within, if you like, the assessment of proportion of dwellings that are in effect HMOs or in some form of multiple occupation, so that sort of 10% threshold would also include student accommodation, purpose-built student accommodation. So they're the two broad options the council's looking at. I think the other issue in terms of purpose-built student accommodation that often gets raised is that if we provide more student accommodation, that will tend to accommodate students in year one, which then as they work through university will just increase the demand even more for HMOs. So again, that's something that we're working closely with the universities on, in that can we provide the right type of student, purpose-built student accommodation to actually house students beyond their first year, but through their following years, thereby helping to manage again the demand for further HMOs. So I just thought it was worth mentioning again, just emphasising that as well as the HMO issue, we're also looking at how we can manage further provision of purpose-built student accommodation, because the two are very closely related. And I just really finish with a plea to everybody that's watching this webinar. Please do submit your comments to the council. Please do read the options document. Provide your comments. We need your feedback in order that we can, properly consider the issues that are of concern to the community and how best to address those through planning policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'll now turn to Chris. If you've got any additional comments you wanted to say at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. It's two really. The first point is that it does make is useful, I think, just to be aware of the government direction with this and the likely imposition of the minimum energy efficiency standard being C for private rented sector by the end of this decade. And the second point is in terms of typical improvements. I mean, Bath, as most of the HMO stock is old, Victorian or listed heritage, including heritage buildings, and the typical improvements are required to start thinking about are things like solid wall insulation, internal and external, and how that will be done, where that can be done, and also underfloor insulation. A lot of suspended timber floors can be improved, the insulation in the property improved by insulating under the floor, finding out information about that as well. And also seriously consider the heating type, moving away from gas, central heating to a low carbon heating system. So those are the areas to start thinking about if we were to go to a C EPC rating for planning.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now, Caru and Alice, who should I take first? Alice and then Caru.
Yeah. No further comments from me, so straight on to Caru.
Thank you. So straight to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's I think there's a lots of a question being submitted. So then that's really helpful. So because we're doing consultation now, then we take all on board, and we can't answer everything today, but this is really helpful. And yeah, so we do this actually is a quite good opportunity. We are revising the parent policy in local plan and also the supplementary planning guidance, planning document. So yes, it's if you can submit your comments, and particularly focusing on the harm caused by whatever you think. It's because in the planning we need to have evidence. And so it's if you can submit a clear evidence of harm you feel, then I mean we can work with comments in the community. But yeah, it's any comments would be very helpful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Caru. And finally to Tim.
Yes, thanks to many people tuned in today. It's very important that people put their comments in, no matter what they are. Quite frank about it, you may think it's irrelevant comments sometimes, but it can be very relevant when we're looking at policy issues to actually try to make the changes we actually need to make to ensure we do get those balanced communities. There's always going to be a need for an HMO. There's a need for PBSAs, but how many is the questions we need to answer? And some of your comments will help us come to that conclusion.
Thank you, Tim. Well, can I say thank you to all my panelists for taking part in today's webinar, and also for everybody who has watched this webinar, and for putting in those questions. I hope you found this to be interesting and informative, and just to remind you all that this is one in a series of webinars that are on the local plan partial update. So please check our website to find details of how you can watch or get involved in the next webinars that are coming up on this issue. So thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing or hearing some of those comments in the next webinars from everybody. So look forward to seeing you all soon. So thank you, and good afternoon.